One of the more provocative stories that you find in the Gospel dealing with the subject of the end times and the final judgment is found in the Gospel of Matthew chapter 25, the story of the parable of the sheep and the goats. And so basically in the context of the story, the Lord uses this really great analogy of the separation of the sheep from the goats to illustrate the separation of the righteous from the wicked during the end times. And so basically I wouldn't mind taking the time right now to kind of walk you through the story kind of step by step. And so as you might recall, at the very beginning of the story, in a certain sense, the Lord turns to these sheep assembled at his right, and he says to them, "Inherit now the kingdom of heaven, prepared for you from the foundation of the world." And then, of course, he turns to the goats assembled at his left, and he says to them, basically, "Depart from me now into the eternal fire." Now, right away, there's a couple of things I want you to notice here. And so first of all, when it comes to this notion of the eternal fire, the notion of eternal fire is basically a metaphor for the pain that some people will feel as a result of being eternally separated from the Lord, as a result of their bad choices. Now, I realize on the face of it that might sound kind of harsh, but you got to think about it like this. Jesus Christ is the way, the truth, and the life. He himself is the principle of life itself. And so therefore, if we find ourselves separated from the Lord, again, as a result of our bad choices, yeah, that's going to be a painful thing. Analogous in a certain sense to being caught up in the flames of an eternal fire. So that's kind of the first thing. But you see, the second thing is this. When the Lord addresses the sheep assembled at his right, and he says to them again, "Inherit now the kingdom of heaven, prepared for you from the foundation of the world," it speaks to the fact that the joys of the kingdom of heaven, which of course is nothing less than sharing God's blessed life, and is in fact the culmination of the great work of salvation stemming from the dawn of creation, is to be received and inherited only by those who have truly become children of our Father in heaven. Now, obviously, despite the question, how are we to become children of our Father in heaven, and therefore rightful heirs of the kingdom of heaven? Well, clearly, when you look at the gospel, a very important prerequisite to achieving the desired effect is to perform what the church now calls the corporal works of mercy. Whether we're talking about such things as feeding the hungry, giving drink to the thirsty, welcoming the stranger, clothing the naked, administering to the sick, or otherwise visiting people in prison. The rationale being, of course, that whenever we take the time to love our brother or sister in need, we are also loving Jesus himself. Which is why the Lord says very famously in the context of the gospel, "Just as you did it to the least of my brethren, you also did it unto me." But you see, we can even take the thing one step further. Because when the Lord refers here to the least of my brethren, he's not speaking exclusively about the poor. And the reason why we know this is because whenever the Lord uses the word brethren in the context of the gospel, he's not talking about blood relations, and he's not talking about people who merely share a common goal or a common philosophy, but rather he's speaking always specifically about the disciples. Case in point, there's this really great story in the context of the Gospel of Matthew chapter 12, where the Lord is approached by these people who say to him, "Your mother and your brethren are basically outside waiting for you." In response to which, you might recall what the Lord actually does. He points to his disciples and he says, "These are my mother and my brethren." And then he goes on to say, "Whoever does the will of my Father in heaven is my brother and my sister and my mother." Which speaks to the fact that whenever the Lord uses the word brethren in the context of the gospel, again, he's not speaking about the poor per se, but rather he's speaking about people who have left everything to follow him, to share in his mission, to be conformed to his very being, which basically includes the disciples and the apostles themselves. What this means, practically speaking, is that if we truly want to become children of our Father in heaven, and therefore, again, rightful heirs to the kingdom of heaven, well, certainly we need to learn to love Jesus Christ in the poor and impoverished in this world, for sure. But at the same time, even though it sounds kind of strange, we need to learn to become poor ourselves, in a sense of taking on the Lord's own spiritual poverty, if you will. Whether we're talking about illness, humiliation, failure, insecurity, conflict, or even death. Mindful of the Lord's words in the Gospel of Matthew chapter 5, where he says very famously, "Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven." Okay, now at this point, I thought it might be kind of helpful to kind of walk you through what we've been talking about today using a few different examples. Beginning with an example drawn from the life of Saint Mother Teresa of Calcutta. So as a matter of background, as you probably know, Mother Teresa was the founder of this group called the Missionaries of Charity, which was basically set up to satiate the thirst of Christ for souls by serving the poorest of the poor. such that the essence of the mission of the Missionaries of Charity is basically built around two different gospel passages. First of all, the phrase, I thirst, which of course you find in the context of the Gospel of John as Jesus is hanging on the cross. But secondly, you did it unto me, which you find in the context of this gospel that we've been studying today. Anyways, as the story goes, there was this guy who eventually became a Franciscan priest, who at the time was helping Mother Teresa to set up this hospital that was meant to assist people who were suffering and dying from HIV and AIDS. And so basically what happened was that one night, this guy was really busy. He was working on his graduate work, and he was also teaching grade school, when Mother Teresa came up to him and said, you will come tonight, basically, to assist when it comes to the night shift at this hospital. And as to be expected, this guy, because he was really busy, he tried to get out of it, but then he realized that it wasn't so much a request as it was a command. And so he went to do his part. And so when he arrived, he put on his apron, he put on his gloves, and he went into his room where he discovered this man who had been neglected for basically a month. And so he was just filthy. So after taking the time to wash him, to bathe him, to put a diaper on him, the guy was about to leave when suddenly the man in the bed said, can you stay with me? Can you stay with me and hold my hand? And so the guy did, right? So he sat by his bed, held this guy's hand, and they didn't really talk. They didn't really exchange any sort of dialogue. There was no kind of high-end theological discussion. They just sat together with this one man holding the other man's hand. And the guy who eventually became a priest said that that particular moment taught him more about his faith than arguably anything he had ever learned before in his life. And you see, the reason I bring this up is because sometimes, many times, we're looking for God. Like we're asking ourselves the question, where is God in my life? Where is God in this world? And so even though the world is certainly God's cathedral, in the sense that technically speaking, you can find God anywhere, the church has always consistently taught that if you really want to find Christ, you can find him in one of two places. First of all, in the Holy Eucharist, which of course is the sacrament representation of the suffering Christ, but you can also find him in the poor. Because of course, again, in the words of today's gospel, whatever you did to the least of my brothers and sisters, you also did it unto me. In any case, the second example I want to share with you is something drawn from my own life, actually. And so basically the story goes like this. After I was newly ordained, I was preaching at this church, and I was doing the weekend rotation. And I had written this homily that was designed to convince people to go to confession. And I was so sure that the thing was going to work that I asked one of my priest friends, who was visiting at the time, to hear confessions after Mass, just in case people wanted to go to confession after hearing the homily. But what ended up happening is that after each of the first 4 Masses, basically no one was going to confession. And so I think over that initial period of time, we only had like 1 or 2 people who had decided to go to confession. As a result of which I decided to pray to the Lord before the 5th and final Mass that weekend. And basically what I was trying to say to God was like, look, I'm clearly doing this wrong. So you got to show me what I'm doing wrong. You got to do something to kind of make this thing work, because clearly there's something off here and I just can't see it. And so what ended up happening is that I ended up giving the same homily during the 5th and final Mass of that weekend. And it turned out to be one of the worst weekend homilies I'd ever given in my life. I made like a ton of mistakes, technical errors, ums and ahs, losing my train of thought. It was like really bad, right? But then, in the aftermath of that Mass, in the aftermath of that homily, a ton of people went to confession. So much so that both of us had to hear confessions for like over 2 hours. And for me, in a funny sort of way, it was reminiscent of the calling of St. Peter, which of course you find in the context of the Gospel of Luke, chapter 5. In a sense that over the course of most of the weekend, we had been fishing all night and catching nothing. But then when the Lord finally said to us, fish on this side of the boat at this particular time, in this particular way, all of a sudden there was a huge crush of fish. So much so that both of us had to hear confessions again for over 2 hours. And I have to admit that that particular moment in my life came to inform my whole approach to ministry going forward from that point on. Because it suddenly occurred to me that in the context of God's divine providence, in the context of the economy of salvation even, the priority is always be placed on prayer and penance, prayer and suffering, prayer and the cross, with our own action always coming very much in the last place. Because you see, the thing we always have to remember here, right, is that we ultimately follow a Lord who has brought about the work of salvation precisely through the crucifixion, as opposed to some political program, which speaks to the fact that through his suffering and death on the cross, he has not only taken on the sins of the world, but he has also taken upon himself every manner of human suffering and affliction, thereby transforming these things into the particular means by which we might find our salvation, our redemption, and our glorification. And you see, practically speaking, what this means is that for those of us who are called to be disciples of the Lord in the most authentic sense of the term, we're obviously called to do likewise. Trusting and believing that our suffering is never without purpose. Our patience will always bear fruit. And the words of St. Paul in his letter to the Romans, all things work together for the good, for those who love the Lord. And may God bless you all.